Let's now take you to neighboring Nigeria, where that country's government has confirmed a U.S. attack on ISIS fighters in northwest Nigeria in retaliation to their continued killing of Christians. The Nigerian government has, however, said that armed groups target both Muslims and Christian communities in that country, and U.S. claims that Christians face persecutions are false. The Nigerian government's reaction is following an announcement by the U.S. President Donald Trump on Thursday that American forces had carried out what he described as a powerful and deadly strike against Islamic State militants in Nigeria, following weeks of sharp criticism of the Nigerian government over the persecution of Christians. In an evening post on his social media platform, Trump offered no operational details and did not specify the scale of damage inflicted or the number of militants targeted in the operation. And joining me in the studio is Executive Director for West Africa Center for Counter-Extremism, Mukhtaru. And I'll also go on Zoom and speak to a national security analyst in Nigeria who goes by the name Dennis Amachiri. I also have international relations expert Nana Yao Mreku on Zoom as well. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Mukhtar, thank you for joining me in the studio. And gentlemen on Zoom, also thank you. But let me begin with you, Dennis, in Nigeria. How do you assess the strategic impact of the recent U.S. strike on ISIS fighters in northwestern part of your country?
Thank you very much. Actually, I'm in the United States. I'm talking to you from New York.
Right.
And of course, what is happening in Nigeria right now, I think is a welcomed thing, whereby we have, the strike happening right there in Sokoto. And why Sokoto, people might ask? Because it's very, very strategic. It's very strategic because when you look at the map of Nigeria and Sokoto, we have the border with Niger Republic, and then, of course, with Benin Republic. And that is the area where we have ISIS and Lakurawa and Mahmouda. These people operate there. So I think it's strategic enough. And it's a warning because there will be more strikes coming up.
Dennis, that's quite an interesting assertion, though. But do you think foreign military interventions like the U.S. strike will help or complicate Nigeria's fight against armed groups like ISIS?
Now, you know that Nigeria has been fighting insurgency, terrorism for the past 16 years and not had any go about it. Now, you find out that in fighting terrorism, you cannot fight it yourself. You really need international support. Even the United States, do have international support when it comes to fighting terrorism. So I think we've been asking for this. We've been looking for weapons, and the first time the United States refused to sell us those arms, but later they did. And I think right now, I think it's a welcome idea.
Wow. And how accurate is the narrative that Christians are being specifically targeted in Nigeria versus the reality of broader insecurity affecting all communities in that country?
Well, my problem is with that narrative. I know President Trump, even woke up to action because he said Christians are being attacked. And that's why he was so interested. But as a security analyst in Nigeria, I will tell you that Christians and Muslims and even people who don't have any religion are being attacked and killed by terrorists. So the target is terrorists. Even on Christmas Day in Borno State, there was a bomb that was exploded in a mosque.
Right.
And killed a lot of people. So it is not a matter of which religion, but I think Nigerians should be happy that we are going after the terrorists.
And Dennis, what long-term measures should your country implement to address extremist threats while maintaining social and religious cohesion?
Well, I think that the Nigerian government have to look beyond these strikes. They should look beyond the strikes, because when you come to think about it, Nigeria has a lot of problems.
Right.
And what are the root causes of these threats? And that's what we should look at. And those root causes are poverty, unemployment, corruption, political instability, and Nigerian leaders have to address this so that after the strike, it is not that you just go back to what we were doing before. Right. Because if you don't provide employment, they will gather again and terrorists will recruit them and will go around the circle once again.
Dennis Amatri is a national security analyst from Nigeria. Thank you very much. Let me now bring in international relations expert, Dr. Nana Yaw Mriku. Glad you could join me this afternoon. How might the U.S. strike on ISIS fighters in northwest Nigeria affect that country's diplomatic relations with the United States?
Well, I think there is something that we must take note of. This was a clear case of intervention by, invitation, and that the kind of strikes that we saw landed as started by President Donald Trump,
right,
was a collaborative effort between the U.S. and Nigeria. And I think that the Nigerian government have tried as much as possible to water down the initial aggressive tone that the Trump administration decided to, impose on that country by saying that they would welcome any assistance from the U.S. government in fighting against the terrorists, as long as it did not violate the territorial integrity of Nigeria. And so I think that going forward, it is not really going to upset, the relationship, the diplomatic ties between the U.S. government and then the Nigerian government. What I envisage, and this is a caution to the Nigerian government, is that to what extent are these attacks going to be sustained? Is it going to be a one-off, or it has long-term implications? And then if that is the case, how is the government, poised into dealing with, the blowbacks, as far as the country's political sovereignty and territorial integrity is concerned?
Right.
Are these attacks going to be precise? The issue of proportionality and precision. Are they going to be civilian casualties? And the fact that they chose to attack Sokoto, right, which is a predominantly Muslim-dominated area, is something that is, instructive. Because my understanding is also that most of these Islamic states in Sahel terrorist activities are concentrated in the northeast, places like Borno, Adamawa, Maiduguri, and other places. So striking Sokoto, does that mean that there are going to be other subsequent strikes in the hotspot of these Islamic states in Sahel in the northeast, as against, doing what is done in northwest? So I think that going forward, we just have to wait and see how things, materialize. But I don't think in the long term it ruptures the relationship between the U.S. and the Nigerian government, as long as the Nigerian government has agreed and come out to state that it's a collaborative effort, it's an intervention by invitation, and not a unilateral strike by the American government. That is what they would have us believe, if you ask me.
Dr. Mriku, could such unilateral military actions by foreign powers set a precedent for intervention in Nigeria or other African countries?
Well, I hope that will not be the case, because clearly then you are going against UN established mandate. If you look at UN Article 2, paragraph 4, it tells you that states shall refrain from the international relations against the threat or use of force. So clearly, this would be, an armed attack that is not, should be condemned in the harshest of words. And so I do not envisage that a unilateral strike will be condoned and will be accepted by Africans. But if it happens, of course, it's really a case for concern. And that is why I was worried when at the nascent stage of US's aggressive, posture against Nigeria. I was very concerned, because Nigeria has a sovereign right that it has to protect. And so if you make this aggressive, threat before collaborating or cooperating with the Nigerian government, it sends a very unpleasant, warning. So I'm hoping that going forward, we will never experience any unilateral attack. And I'm hoping that, once again, I hope that the Nigerian government was not bullied into accepting this cooperation from the American government in this strike against Islamic State, in that region.
And Dr. Mreku, how might U.S. claims of Christian persecution in Nigeria influence international perceptions of the country's internal security and governance, you'd say?
Well, even before I come to that question, I have said that the Trump administration is a transactional government, right?
Right.
It is pursuing what you call transactional pragmatism. And so what I would want to say is that there is a domestic constituency that the Trump administration is seeking to please, especially ahead of the 2026 midterm election that is coming up in November, what I call the Christian evangelicals. You remember that the U.S. has what a congressional law called the International Religious Act that was instituted by the government in 1998, and Trump is seeking to implement this to satisfy a domestic, constituency. So, in a way, right, it puts Nigeria not in a positive limelight. But the thing is that the statistics are also clear that attacks has not been against Christians alone.
Yeah.
It is not a Christian genocide per se. It is true that in the last 14 years, 52,000 Christians have been killed, some have been kidnapped. But there's a significant number around that area that also speaks of how Muslims have also been, killed and persecuted and kidnapped. Look, just because we came here, and I think one of the panel members stated it, there was an attack in a mosque in Maiduguri that left 7 Muslims dead.
Yeah.
So the thing is, if you want to hold these issues to credible levels, attacks has been against both Christians and Muslims. So I think that we need to weigh the options and look at the statistics to really, substantiate what the Trump administration is saying. You remember, it was this same Trump administration said that there was, white genocide against white South Africans in South Africa. That proved to be utter, false. So I think that we need to just weigh the options and look at the statistics, the facts.
And in what ways would you say could this strike impact Nigeria's effort to manage extremism domestically without appearing dependent on foreign military assistance?
Can you take it again? I think I may have lost you there.
In what ways do you see this new strike impact Nigeria's efforts to manage extremism domestically without seeming to appear dependent on foreign military assistance?
That's a very interesting question that you should ask. But you know what? I think that Nigeria has been trying to deal with this debacle in the last 15 years. And it has very little evidence to show that it's able to do this on its own.
Yeah.
There is what we call the multinational joint task force that was made up of Nigeria, Chad, Niger, and Cameroon in trying to deal with this terrorist debacle in that area. But I mean, we understand that the political situation in Niger and Chad is not, it's nothing to write home about to keep this joint task force together. So I think that it is an issue that has become too difficult for the Nigerian government to handle. Because look, around the 36th state of Nigeria, the Nigerian military is helping to deal with fire outbreaks. If you go to the northern part, it is dealing with Islamist insurgency. If you go to the southeast, it is dealing with secessionist crisis. And if you go to the south, there is a huge, armed groups that are fighting over the oil discovered in those areas. So I think that the Nigerian government has a lot on its hands at the moment. And I think that this international cooperation, because mind you, terrorism is a transnational development. It is not something that states are able to do by themselves. So I think that any international cooperation that helps the Nigerian government into nipping this, albatross in the bud, as long as it does not violate the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of Nigeria, I think for me is a welcome, cooperation.
Dr. Nanaya Mreku is an international relations expert. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Let's come back to the studio, and I still have Mukhtar here. Grateful for your time once again. There are now concerns, although the Nigerian government has released a statement that they are in support of this, and it was, a coordinated effort between them and U.S. authorities to launch these strikes. But there are concerns that this was perhaps a bully. The United States bullied Nigeria into coordinating with them to launch these alleged strikes. Is there any truth in that?
Well, of course, 2 months ago, we saw the official statement from the U.S. president relating to the threat around the alleged persecution of Christians in Nigeria, and threatened some kind of unilateral military action in Nigeria. Following that, we've seen significant diplomatic engagements between senior officials of both countries, including the Foreign Affairs Ministry, the National Security Advisor to the Nigerian President, and other senior government officials meet in Washington and engage over this. Ever since, we've seen significant tone down. The language and posture and engagement has significantly changed. And as you notice, in the last 12 hours, you've seen significant language shift in terms of what must have taken place in Nigeria. And we saw official acknowledgement from the Secretary of Defense in the US, acknowledge the cooperation and the relationship between the Nigerian government and that of the US in these operations. We've seen AFRICOM officially acknowledging that this was a product of mutual cooperation and intelligence sharing between them. And the Foreign Affairs Minister of Nigeria, of course, issued a statement acknowledging that this was carried out through the cooperation and collaboration between the two states. And I think that within the international system, there won't always be friction, there won't always be things and tensions like that, but it's important how we deal with it and manage those relationships along mutual goals and mutual interests. And I think that it's a great thing we need to build on. And I think I like to focus more on the reality or the subject matter in terms of this kind of issue. Violent extremism and terrorism has been the single biggest threat to national and regional security in West Africa in the last 1.5 decades. And today, anyone who is following and working within the security space within the region will tell us that the West African region is under siege, under serious siege, and we appear to have been overwhelmed by insecurity in ways that we do not seem to have a blueprint in terms of addressing it. Nigerian government has been fighting this battle for more than 15 years in this space, and clearly it shows that they've been overwhelmed. And I've listened to the two speakers speak brilliantly about the character of the threat that we're dealing with in Nigeria. We saw significant, reduction in terms of the attacks in the Northeast by traditional terrorist operations. We've seen the numbers go down, the attacks go down, and it was been a big source of relief in terms of dealing with the threat. And almost at the same time, we're seeing a huge emergence of another typology of violence in the northwestern part of Nigeria, which is within the subject matter of discussion, for discussion where Sokoto is situated. In the northwest, it is not the traditional terrorism that happens in that space. Right. We safely describe that as banditry, and it is pervasive. It is huge. It is, in terms of the numbers, in terms of the attacks. And the numbers from that particular type of violence, it's even more, exceeds the numbers in terms of fatality from traditional terrorism. And I think that is one of the main factors responsible for the choice of attacks in this particular operation.
We've been speaking to some of the journalists, and including the security analyst that we spoke, who comes from Nigeria. The general mood, according to what they tell us, is that it appears people are, happy with this. With this intervention by the United States. Are they jubilating too soon, Nigerians, some of them?
I think we should welcome that. And I think it is understandable that people would appreciate what has happened. Because clearly, it has been the reality for so long that Nigeria needed more international support, international partnerships and collaboration to deal with the threat. And of course, they have reached out in terms of international partnerships and all that, and that includes the US. Of course, the kind of partnership they may have been looking for may not have been available at the time. But now is another great time. And it has happened that there is, a big action that has taken place that should threaten, serve as a source of deterrence to the operators within that region. And I think that it should be welcome. Anything that contributes to, fighting terrorism, fighting violent extremism, fighting banditry should be welcomed. And I think that it's an opportunity to kind of summon a new sort of arrangement around counterterrorism within the region to deal with terrorism. Other than that, all of us are under siege by this kind of threat.
Nigeria is our closest ally in the West African sub-region, probably the whole of Africa. What lessons can Ghana draw from what happened last night?
Of course, Ghana can draws a lot of lessons from the happenings within the sub-region in terms of security. First of all, you're looking at, the fact that they are underpinnings and the drivers that lead societies into this kind of abyss. And I think that we have been very, very intentional about the fact that this nation exists not without the reality that we're a peaceful and stable nation, and that nothing should be done in any way to undermine that peace and stability that we've enjoyed, at least for the last half century. We've seen the importance of international collaboration, international cooperation in dealing with common threats. And you've seen, past presidents couch a kind of, regional leadership posture within the ECOWAS, within the African Union, and other initiatives within. The current president did not mince words when he took over as leader, when he saw what was happening within the sub-region as a huge, huge threat to our regional stability. This, at the time, is almost a very fragmented regional space for security. And immediately, the appointment of the special envoy for the Sahel, it's a huge, huge, commitment to patching up, the kind of fragmentation we were looking at. And that is significant. We need to look at it from a regional perspective. Terrorism cannot be won. And you listen to Mr. Dennis talk about it. This is a threat that goes beyond borders. It knows no borders. And so you need to constitute regional, strategies and regional collaborations, build goodwill with partners within and outside the space to deal with it. And that's something important we can take from this exercise.
Before the strike, President Donald Trump had always maintained that there were persecution of Christians in Nigeria, which has time and again been debunked by almost everybody. And of course, it was based on this premise why this strike was launched in the first place. Do you think that the U.S. appeared misinformed when they launched the strike? Because obviously the reason for their strike has been disputed so many times.
Well, if you follow closely President Trump's policies and strategies and approach to the things within and outside within the international space, you would see that he works in line with his policy agenda and interests. And if you look at what is happening, you primarily would make reference to a domestic audience that he's, working along with. You listen to Dr. Miracle, who make reference to the domestic, constituency, which is the Christian evangelist, together with huge and senior lawmakers who have been lobbying, the presidency in terms of reference to what is going on in Nigeria, reference to the fact that Christians have been, victims of terrorism in Nigeria, and all of that. And these are powerful interest groups in there. And so he needs to, to respond to that kind of constituency. You've seen that. Beyond that, the operations fall within the U.S. international, interest when it comes to security, in terms of counterterrorism. U.S. is the single biggest, stakeholder when it comes to fighting terrorism abroad. And you listen to the arguments around the Religious Freedoms Act of the U.S., it obligates them to protect religious interests everywhere, religious freedoms everywhere. You saw the Uyghurs, issue in China. U.S. was very vocal about it. We saw what happened in Bangladesh. U.S. very, very vocal about it. And now is Nigeria. We're seeing the vocal nature of the U.S. Officials on that particular issue. And so for me, I think it falls in line with the U.S. interests at home and abroad. And that's why you would see that commitment to dealing with it.
We do not know the level of distraction this launch might have caused, but do you think this will put a bit of fear, or even if not a bit, any fear at all, in the terrorists in Nigeria?
It certainly will. It certainly would put a significant fear. It's a big source of deterrence for extremist groups, especially when attacks are coming from quarters that they may not be able to match. It's a big sense of deterrence. But it needs to be coordinated in a way that builds and elicits goodwill and support from the local population. Throughout the world, in terms of history, we haven't seen situations where counterterrorism operations succeed without commitment and goodwill of the local population where these things happen. And it's important that this gives an opportunity for the two nations to build goodwill together in tackling this problem. And the question is, how often are we going to have these strikes happen? And how long are we going to have it? what is the scope of operations in terms of this particular exercise? And that's important in terms of looking at the prospects of success in this exercise.
The West African sub-region has become a hotspot for terrorism, as has been, made public. Do you think that this strike that happened in Nigeria, of course, Donald Trump has vowed that it is going to continue to strike these terrorists if they do not stop their persecution of what they term as Christian persecution. But do you think that this strike by the U.S. should be extended to other West African countries to, ward off the fear of terrorism in the sub-region?
Terrorism is context specific. So depending on what the the underpinnings are, the context is, you look for a certain sort of partnership to deal with. And it depends on the stakeholders at play. We've seen, terrorism significantly descend towards coastal states, and with Burkina Faso now emerging as the deadliest, space for terrorism globally. The Global Terrorism Index, reveals Burkina Faso as the epicenter of terrorism globally. And that could and should imply that Burkina Faso should be escalating their commitment to dealing with terrorism in ways that no nation has, because they are the biggest victims of terrorism. And we've seen Burkina Faso reach out to different partners in dealing with the threat in that space. And we've seen America reach out to them in terms of partnership with the Burkinabés in dealing with terrorism. We haven't seen that work. And so it depends on the commitment of those, those stakeholders in dealing with the threat. And at each time, the leadership makes the decision, makes the choice.
I don't know if Ghana, we can say that we should count ourselves lucky, because at least we are one of the few shining stars within a bloc that is ravaged by terrorism. But should we start fearing now?
Well, of course, our situation is both a mixture of luck and also dedication and commitment to, security in this space. I mean, the state, if you reduce that to luck, it might mean that the state is not, the effort of the state is not counted for what we are enjoying today. There's both two situations. Yes, we should count ourselves lucky in the sense that in one breath, you look at the vulnerabilities and the factors that lead societies into the abyss of terrorism. We have those vulnerabilities in our space, and yet we've been spared, this eventuality. And at the same time, you look at other factors in terms of the state and the things that this nation has built in terms of resilience and in terms of the architecture around security. You see a very strong and robust architecture when it comes to security. So we should count ourselves lucky that it hasn't happened in this space. But we cannot reduce our chance, our fate to just to chance. We need to work at it. We need to be very deliberate and intentional about building peace, about building cohesion, and about addressing the factors that lead people to engage in violent extremism.
Mukhtar, don't go yet, but I understand that we still have Dr. Nana Yao Mriku. Okay, we've lost them on the line right now, but I guess I may be able to ask you that question. Now, the scramble for influence in Africa, we've had the likes of China, US, and then Russia, all trying to stamp their influence on the continent. There are concerns from the US quarters that the Americans appear to be losing grip on their influence to China and Russia on the continent. With this new strike, it appears that it's been welcomed by most Nigerians. Do you think this might also solidify the previous influence that they used to have on the continent and even in Nigeria, the continent's most populated country? Do you think it will let more people want to be affiliated to the United States now on the continent?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
This is just a project. It's it's a small project in terms of the relationship between the two nations. And it's too small to determine the trajectory of relationship between Nigeria or Africa and the US. Within the broader scheme of things, we're looking at several other things when it comes to trade and trade relations between the two. And other influences, influencing factors in terms of technology, in terms of entertainment, in terms of sports, and all other things that represent big sources of influence on cultures. China, for a very long time, has been very deliberate about what they're seeking in partnerships. They're looking at numbers, they're looking at trade, and they're looking at the economy and factors like that. The kind of relationships that the U.S. traditionally projects or preaches goes beyond the numbers. Right. It's more around values, it's more around ideals. The ideas of democracy, the rule of law, rules-based relationships and governance, factors like that underpin the relationship between the U.S. and its partners. And of course, in very recent times under the current leadership, we're seeing not necessarily a shift, but a significant addition and emphasis on transactional relationships between the U.S. and other nations. What does that mean or imply in terms of its global standing comparative to other competitors like China? It may mean that nations like China, within Africa, it represents something significant. Countries like, within Africa are looking for easier partnerships. Easier partnerships are devoid of rules, they are devoid of values, they are devoid of checklists. That example, if you employ underage kids in our cocoa plantations, we will not buy from you. Right. We will not trade with you. If you have illegal mining going on and your forest is devastated by illegal mining, we would not buy gold from you. We would not go ahead with a certain trade deal with you. Those are things that traditional Western European partnerships emphasize on. And yet African nations are not suited or do not like those kinds of partnerships. So you see them drifting and shifting towards Asia, China, and other nations that do not have this checklist, as oversight for things here. And what does that mean for the long-term relationship and long-term development in our part of the world? It is disastrous. Disastrous in the sense that there are so many things in our space that we need to emphasize on in terms of oversight, in terms of the values of democracy, governance, freedom, and the things that underpin modern societies. If we shift away from these values and these rules-based governance systems, we are doomed. And we need to pull away from the brink of that.
Mukhtar Mumuni Mukhtari, thank you very much for your expert analysis. As always, he's the Executive Director at the West Africa Center for Counter-Extremism. You're still watching The Pulse here on Joy News. We return from the break with more stories. Don't go anywhere.